Okay, we are almost going to start. Who's going first? I introduce you, and then you can. Borislav. So welcome everyone. I am Leah Shortino. I am the director and founder of Junction, and Junction is the venue you are in or you are looking on Facebook Live. We are very proud to have again some friend and colleague who will discuss migration in a very important dimension, as we know from the floods that are happening all over Southeast Asia at the moment. They remind us about the impacts of man-made disaster as well as climate change. So without further ado, I will introduce Borislav, who represents the Global Alliance Against Trafficking of Women, as well as the newsletter. No, it's not a newsletter, a journal. Yeah, a journal. And this is indeed, today we are going to discuss one of the journal, which focus specifically on climate change and migration as well as exploitation. So please, Borislav.
Thank you, Leah. Hello? It's on, right? Okay, thank you, Leah, for the kind introduction, and thank you for agreeing to host us for this event. My name is Borislav Gerasimov, and as Leah said, I'm the editor of the journal Anti-Trafficking Review, which is an open access peer-reviewed journal that focuses on the issue of human trafficking in its broader context and intersections with gender, labor, migration, and development. Now, before I introduce the event and our speakers tonight, a few words about, or a little bit more about the journal that we are presenting today. It was founded in 2012, or it was founded in 2011, and the first issue was published in 2012. We publish 2 special issues every year, each of which is dedicated to a specific predetermined theme that we've identified as current or under-researched, and which has a guest editor who is an academic. And the journal is published by the Global Alliance Against Trafficking Women, which is a network of NGOs worldwide that advocate for the human rights of migrants and victims of trafficking. Now, as Leah mentioned, today we are going to present the latest issue of the journal, which is themed climate crisis, climate emergency, migration, trafficking, and exploitation. And I think there is by the door, there is a QR code that you can scan to reach the website of the journal and this special issue. And the reason we decided to focus an issue on the climate crisis is, I suppose, obvious that, and I suppose I don't need to explain to the people who are here in this room that the climate crisis is the most pressing challenge of our times. As Leah mentioned, just in the past few weeks, we are witnessing again destructive floods and weather events across Southeast Asia and South Asia. I think the latest death toll was above 1,000 people across Indonesia, Thailand, and Sri Lanka, and more than 1 million displaced only in Indonesia, and hundreds of thousands more in Thailand and Sri Lanka. So clearly, it is a very pressing topic, which is, or a very pressing global challenge, which is only going to get worse in the coming years. Every year is breaking new heat and temperature records. Every year is worse than the previous one, and and all these climate events are becoming, or extreme weather events are becoming more severe and longer in duration, causing more and more damage. At the same time, there are the so-called slow onset events of droughts and soil erosion and water salinization and so on that are destroying traditional livelihoods such as small scale farming, subsistence farming, or fishing. At the same time, so yeah, as we know, the climate crisis is wreaking havoc, destroying people's livelihoods and lives and homes and so on, and forcing many people to migrate, and at the same time to migrate under distressful conditions, and forcing some people to accept exploitative job offers. And this is what we wanted to explore, because in the especially the links between climate change or the climate crisis and human trafficking are sometimes a bit misunderstood or presented in a way that's more simplistic and sensationalistic, especially by the media or NGOs, which often link extreme weather events such as typhoons or floods to human trafficking in a way that's very direct. Like usually it's presented as, okay, there is tsunami or typhoon, and then traffickers come and start snatching people, women and girls from their homes. That's not how it happens. We need to understand better the links between how the climate crisis destroys people's livelihoods, then makes them desperate for job opportunities, which then willing to accept exploitative job offers or to migrate under risking conditions, and then these situations might turn into trafficking. So this was a bit of a background into why we were interested in this topic. And now, without further explanations, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Tonight we have online on Zoom, we'll be joined by Ruta Nimkar, who is the co-founder and director of Meraki Labs and a PhD student at the University of Oxford. And here in the room with us, we have Sallie next to me, who is an associate professor of human geography in the environmental science program at the Charles Sturt University in Australia. And David Feingold, who is a research anthropologist and the director of Ophidian Research Institute and Ophidian Films. So both or all Sallie was one of the guest editors of the issue that we will be discussing today, the issue of the journal, together with Denise Brennan from Georgetown University in the United States. And all three of the speakers have written articles in the issue, which you can read online. Like I said, all articles are open access, free to read. And today they are going to speak a little bit about their articles, as well as their broader work on the topics of climate change and migration. So with that, I will pass the floor to Ruta Nimkar. The article she wrote, co-wrote together with Julia Schwers, is titled "The Vulnerability Gap: How People Affected by Climate Change Perceive Their Circumstances and Make Risky Migration Decisions." And she will speak particularly about the article's findings from the Philippines. Over to you, Ruta. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you very much, Boris, and everybody for the opportunity for us to contribute to this special issue. I wanted to start by telling the story of somebody that that we met as a part of our research. we met a lady in the Bikol region who herself had experienced exploitation due to climate change. When we asked her to tell her story, she told us the story about living an agricultural life in Bikol. Over time, agricultural productivity, so the productivity of her farm, grew lower and lower. Her family was still able to make ends meet. Things weren't very bad, but a typhoon hit and destroyed her house. Her family didn't have savings, and it was considered the role of the man to stay with the house. It was the role of the woman to go abroad and to make extra money so that the house could be rebuilt. Because of this, she asked around among contacts, she asked where she could find job opportunities, and the opportunities that seemed to be the most profitable were in the Gulf. So following advice of friends and contacts, she went to the Gulf. She used a recruitment agency that was a regular recruitment agency, but upon arriving in the Gulf, she was working for an exploitative employer who took away her passport, who physically abused her, who sexually abused her, and who did, in fact, sell her to another employer. She ran away from the other employer, and keeping in mind the pre-departure briefing that she had received as a result of the migration management process in the Philippines, she went to the embassy. She went to the Filipino embassy. She arrived on Christmas Eve. The embassy staff weren't actually there at the moment, but the guards at the embassy kept her and took her in and kept her safe until the first working day. And the staff at the embassy then worked for 3 months to get her to allow her to kind of to negotiate a solution with her employers for her to return home. This was one of many examples in of the research that we did in both the Philippines and Ethiopia of the complicated relationship between climate and exploitation. Climate change has had a long-term effect on the well-being of households, particularly vulnerable and marginalized households. And in the event of an additional shock, it can push people to take migration decisions that they know are risky. In the article that Julia and I wrote for the Anti-Trafficking review, we propose that it's interesting to use the adaptive preferences framework to look at the choices faced by different households. The adaptive preferences framework basically consists of 3 main ways of looking at households' decisions. The first is that households might be making decisions in conditions that are not conducive to flourishing. Basically, they're pushed into decisions because they're in difficult situations. In the context of the communities that we were kind of conducting research with in the Philippines, the conditions that weren't conducive to flourishing involved long-term deterioration of agricultural productivity, long-term deterioration of fishing productivity, reduction in infrastructure. So roads were washed away, buildings weren't well built, etc. And a consistent perception among people that we interviewed in both qualitative and quantitative research that things had been getting worse over time, that income had eroded compared to 5 years ago, that agricultural productivity had eroded compared to 5 years ago, and that households were less able to protect themselves. So risky migration decisions are being made because people feel forced to go. The second precept of the adaptive preferences framework is that migration decisions are being made despite the fact that the individual migrating knows that they might not flourish when they migrate. Knowledge about the potential for exploitation was widespread in the communities that we were engaging with in Bicol. About 39% of the migrants that of the communities that we collected quantitative data from in the Philippines knew that there was a chance of exploitation. Many people knew a family or member or a friend who had experienced physical or sexual abuse in the Gulf, who had had their passports taken away from them, who hadn't been fed enough on a day-to-day basis. Despite knowing these difficult conditions, people still chose to migrate. One of the primary reasons is that people were migrating not only for themselves, but for their households. And this is something that many other anti-trafficking review articles have explored. People knew that the money that they were going to make in the Philippines would strengthen the position and the resilience of their friends and family. And more specifically, it would allow them to invest in infrastructure that would help them on a household level. So for instance, some of the communities that we were in, you could see equipment that was purchased for agricultural or fishing needs. You could see houses that were made out of concrete that were less likely to wash away in the rain. And the enumerators that we were working with pointed to those households and said, those households have a member who's migrated, they have a member in the Gulf. That's why they're able to invest in additional infrastructure. So the individual might not flourish when they migrate, but there's a perception that the household will flourish and will be more able to defend itself against climate change in the future. The third point about adaptive preferences framework is that it asks whether risky migration would persist under other circumstances. So would people migrate if their conditions were a little bit better? It's a bit difficult to look and to answer this question because it's a complex counterfactual question. But what we noted was, both from the quantitative and from the qualitative work that we did, was that individuals might choose to migrate if their context was better. They might choose to migrate even if the effects of climate change were less severe, but they might migrate differently and in conditions of greater safety. So for example, in the quantitative survey showed that people were much more likely to migrate internally. So their desire was much more to migrate internally within the Philippines compared to the Gulf, and that they chose to migrate to the Gulf because they perceived the higher potential for profit. The lady that we spoke to would have conducted more research on the employment route that she chose, and she would have had a greater chance to build her own coping strategies if she'd migrated, if she'd been able to migrate with the benefit of time and not in a circumstance where her house had just been destroyed and she needed to migrate to earn money immediately. So in short, the article that Julia and I wrote for the Anti-Trafficking Review, it aims to argue that households are using adaptive preferences. Their choices are being constrained to a greater and greater degree because of climate change. And as a result, people are choosing to migrate under risky conditions, knowing the conditions are risky, and knowing that it's going to be challenging for the individual to flourish upon migration. And they're taking these decisions despite the fact that they wouldn't take the same decisions in the absence of climate change. So climate change makes people make riskier decisions. This article and the research that we did was funded by IOM's CREATE project as well as the Home Office. And we have also written reports for IOM on the policy implications and the programming implications of the ways in which climate change affects exploitation and trafficking. For us, the important point about the adaptive preferences framework is that it helps to frame how governments and other actors can engage with vulnerable individuals and communities who are at risk of exploitation due to climate change. One of the super interesting points coming out of the Philippines was, so we did data collection in both the Philippines and Ethiopia. And one of the things that we noticed was that something that could help individuals reduce risk or access risk mitigation measures was something that people already knew. So if a government service had been provided to individuals or communities for a long time, they were more likely to trust that service in the event of difficult climate situations or in the event of exploitation. So in the case of the Philippines, for a long time, the government's invested in migration management, in making sure that individuals have access to information about migration, to pre-departure briefings, etc. It doesn't work with all communities. It's not a perfect system, but in the communities where we collected data, people were very widely aware of the pre-departure briefings. In the event that somebody experienced exploitation, there was also a really strong indication that people knew where to go. So they knew to go to an embassy, they knew to go and ask for support from the government. So the government's long-term investment in migration management had a positive effect, especially when you compare it to Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, the government has not invested in migration management systems. It's had, in fact, a very up and down regulation situation regarding migration. And as a result, very few, if any, of the people that we talked to in Ethiopia considered the government to be a part of their coping strategy if they experienced exploitation. The point about this is you can also see the reverse in some situations. So in Ethiopia, the government had invested in very long-term outreach programs to vulnerable communities. So specifically, they'd invested in agricultural productivity programs, distribution of seeds and tools, distribution of agricultural expertise to rural and vulnerable areas. Households subject to climate change in Ethiopia trusted those mechanisms. They knew that the government was providing these services, and they did their best to use these services to try to build resilience against climate change. In the Philippines, this agricultural outreach system was much weaker, and people didn't rely on the government to try to build their resilience at home. In short, the point that the article is trying to make, and that the policy paper is trying to make, is that climate change reduces people's options over time. It puts people in a position where they're taking riskier decisions for their households and for themselves. They wouldn't take these decisions under other circumstances. Because there's a gradual erosion of the options available to people, people are also seem to be relying more on programs and contacts that they know. So on family networks, on friend networks, on aspects of the government that they've engaged with previously. In that respect, it can be possible to support people to cope by working with mechanisms that they already know, policies that they already know, social networks that they already know, remittance flows that they already know. So it could be the case that building adaptive capacity and building resilience is about scaling up what people are already doing, because they're in a context where what they're already doing and who they already know is what they trust the most. Thank you very much. I hope it's okay if I can pass over now.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruta. Yeah, I think you explained very well or your article explains very well the way climate change impacts people's decision to migrate. Of course, it's not the only thing that that forces people to decide to migrate, but it's one more stressor that adds to many other stressors. So now, David and Sallie, would you like to come back here? I will pass the floor to Sallie, and just for the audience, we will hear two more presentations by Sallie and David, and then we hope to have maybe around half an hour for comments from you or questions for the speakers. So I'll pass the floor to Sallie now, who also, like I mentioned, she wrote an article about the experiences of Filipino fishers on deep water fishing vessels, and how these, what did you call them, water-based sectors or sea-based sectors or how climate change is affecting work in sea-based sectors. Over to you, Sallie.
Okay. Yeah, is it working? Yeah. Thank you, Bobby, and thanks to GATW for organising this event. And also to Denise Brennan, who's not here, for inviting me to co-edit this issue with her. It was really her idea. It's her baby, and she really took the lead in putting together the special issue. So I thought just to kind of flesh out a little bit more what Bobby has talked about with the special issue and what we were really hoping to achieve and the kinds of issues that we wanted to raise through the different papers. And mostly we think we did that. But there were 4 really key issues concerning the relationship between anthropogenic environmental change and labour exploitation and precarious migration. So 4 things that we really wanted to look at and foreground in the papers. And the first one is really very similar to what Vanessa was just talking about, which is, you know, what are the drivers for precarious migration, and what role does climate change and broader issues around environmental degradation, what role does that play in people's migration decisions? And, you know, does it actually intensify or heighten people's vulnerability in the migration process and their experiences of working? And I think that, you know, that talk that we've just had really illustrates that very well. So, and I would say that most of the research that's coming out on this relationship focuses on that aspect, which is, you know, to what extent is migration, particularly precarious labour migration, increasingly driven by climate change? But beyond that, I think that there are also 3 other relationships or 3 other aspects to this relationship that I really wanted to highlight. And the first of these other ones is how changing and worsening environmental conditions, such as extreme heat, how are they impacting people's experiences of work, especially for people who are already in precarious working situations. And of course, we know that within this region that most of the precarious work is undertaken by migrant workers. So really what I'm saying is how is racial capitalism linked to climate change? And this is the one that I want to come back to, because this is the focus of my little paper in the special issue. So I'll come back to that. But the third relationship, or the third aspect of this relationship, I think, is how, and this is one where unfortunately we didn't get any papers in the special issue on this. I was really hoping to see some, but I'm really interested in the question of what's the relationship between precarious work, particularly unfree or forced labour, and the intensification of environmental degradation? I think this is a really, really super important question. And it first came to my mind when I was interviewing Filipino and Indonesian fishermen a few years ago, and they talked about their involvement in shark finning. And we know that shark finning is actually, I mean, you know, sharks are now, many sharks are endangered. They're endangered species. And so these men talked about the necessity of shark finning because they were denied salary. And the only way that they could actually make any kind of decent money on these fishing vessels was to engage in the practice of shark finning. And they would get like a piece kind of rate, I suppose, for engaging in this practice. So there's a link between precarious, hyper precarious work and further environmental degradation through the deliberate targeting of endangered fish species. So I really think that this is an area where there a lot more work can be done on this issue. And the last one is something that is super important, and we did have a couple of papers in the special issue on this, which is about exploitation in the green economy. So to what extent is the transition to a green economy a just transition or not? And we're already hearing a lot about exploitative labour practices for in the mining sector relating to critical minerals. And so again, this is an issue where I think a lot more work can be done. So having said that, I just wanted to return to a couple of bits of research that I've been doing on this issue. One, which is the piece in the Anti-Trafficking Review, which is just a very small provocation piece, really. And it's looking at the question of how does working on industrial fishing vessels relate to climate change? And it's kind of a bit of a, an outlier question or an outlier issue, because we tend to think about climate change as relating more to land-based sectors rather than sea-based work. But this question really came to me because what I was finding in my interviews were that many, many fishers were suffering the effects of kidney failure. And so that, of course, is a very serious issue, but treatable, highly treatable. So the causes, what are the causes of this particular health concern on these fishing vessels? Well, the main cause is a lack of fresh, clean, potable drinking water. And so the question then becomes, well, if there's no clean water available for fishing crew to drink, what do they drink? They drink seawater. And so what is happening is that particularly in tropical and subtropical zones, which is where a lot of these industrial fishing vessels operate, there is increasing, really, really highly increasing salination of the water. And so the men are drinking this water because there's no option for any other type of water on the vessels. And their body, their kidneys can't handle it. And so in the long or the medium term, this leads to compromised kidney function. And in many cases, and again, this is related to work that I've been focusing on a lot in the last 12 months or so, is the case of deaths of migrant fishing crew and also of the long-term impacts of illness and injury on the fishing vessels. So here we have, it's not a link that you would necessarily make, but it's an important link, because what we're really saying here is that people who are really considered to be disposable workers are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change in their work. And this can lead to many, many different impacts, including deteriorating health. So that was really the main focus of that little intervention that I did for Anti-Trafficking Review. I also looked more broadly, or touched on in that piece, the other health issues that migrant fishing crew tend to experience, or one of the others, which is also a lack of decent food. And the lack of decent food on these fishing vessels, it's also a bit of an environmental issue in a way, because it's really related to the relationship between profitability of these industrial fishing fleets and the environment. There's a really important relationship here. So environmental degradation and environmental change has had enormous impacts on the profitability of the industrial fishing sector. There are less fish to catch, and you have to go further out to sea to catch them. And a lot of that is because of IUU fishing. And there's also the intersecting problem of the rising costs of fuel for these fishing vessels. So fishing vessels are going further out to sea, and they're staying out there for a longer period of time. And because they're doing this, there is very limited availability of fresh food on the fishing vessels. And of course, this also relates to the availability of fresh water. So because of that, the fishers tend to be given or eat food that's not nutritious, has very little nutritional value, may be expired, and this has been well researched already. This has been documented, and there's lots of publications about the lack of decent food on the fishing vessels. But I think what's really missing is that we really need to start thinking about the way that we connect these problems to the broader structural and environmental context in which these things are occurring. So in this particular case with the fishing vessels, consequences are the deterioration of health of the migrant fishing crew. So how am I? What's the time? 3 or 4 minutes. Okay, all right. So so you can feel free to ask me about that a little bit more in the questions. But I really also wanted to just flag another piece of research that I did. Well, it's actually a few years ago now in Singapore with migrant construction workers there from Tamil Nadu in India and from Bangladesh. And this wasn't something that was published in the Anti-Trafficking Review issue. This came out earlier this year in another journal. And this was really a very large-scale study looking at precarious labour of construction workers. And so there was never really a focus on climate change. I didn't really ask questions about, climate drivers of migration. But the really interesting thing about this research was, as I was going through the data and reading the interviews and so on, there was this undercurrent, there was this, underlying narrative around the impact of environmental degradation in creating household and livelihood insecurity. And I thought this was interesting. And so I just pulled out and really looked a lot more closely at the data that spoke to this relationship. So there were a couple of things about that then, just quickly. One was that it was very rarely about rapid onset climate change events. It was very rarely about typhoons or floods. It was about the slow onset events. And so the paper that I wrote about this really tried to disrupt this kind of dominant narrative that we see, that rapid onset climate change events result in human trafficking. And that may or may not be the case, and I'm sure it is to some extent, but I think we just need to make a lot more analytical and discursive space to look at the relationship between slow onset climate change and precarious migration. And so this was definitely the case for these men from Tamil Nadu. It was primarily prolonged drought and the inability to continue to make a profitable livelihood from farming activities. And in central and delta Bangladesh, which is where most of my participants were from, there was flooding, but there was really a changing water table. And this was just an ebb and flow and a slow change thing. And what that really amounted to over time was salination of their land. And so again, we have this slow incremental change where increasing salination of the soil was really impacting their rural livelihoods, their farming livelihoods. So that was the main thing that kind of came out of that research, is really a need to look much more closely at slow onset climate change events, and also to kind of disrupt the idea that it's always or necessarily women and girls who are more vulnerable to unsafe migration as a result of climate change. So in Bangladesh and India, to some extent that is true, but for the most part, it's related to male out migration, the male breadwinner model, I guess, if you want to call it that, of transnational labour migration. And so it's what I really tried to do was unsettle some of our dominant framings of the relationship between precarious migration and climate change. And the last thing I'll say is that I could not have come to this data from that study of South Asian migrant workers if I had just undertaken a kind of, quantitative survey, right? The only way I came to this data was by engaging very, very deeply through not just in-depth interviews, but giving migrant workers the opportunity to write their own narratives about their own experiences in ways that reflected their own frames of reference and their own priorities. So it was really very much an unstructured research process. And in doing that, that then gave these men the opportunity to talk about the impact of climate change on their pre-existing livelihoods and on their families and their households and their communities. So, because I didn't ask about climate change. So methodology, I think, and the approach to the research is also super important in looking at, climate change, because we don't often know. And this is a growing but also a new area of research. So for me, more open-ended, more qualitative, more participatory research processes can really help us understand better the lived experience of precarious migration and its relationship to climate change. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Sallie. Yes, the research methodology you mentioned is very important. And of course, Bangladesh is one of the most climate vulnerable countries, I think. And the point about the deep sea water, I keep forgetting, distant water fishing vessels was also very interesting. As you also say in the article, usually most climate research focuses on land-based sectors. So this was very interesting. So we'll turn to David now, who also has something to say about fishermen or fishers, but in a different context. David has been living and working in this region in Thailand and Cambodia for many decades, and has recently, well, he will speak more about his research in Cambodia, which also I think has an interesting methodology with the photography research. Over to you, David.
Thank you. I'm going to stand up because I'm so jet lagged that if I don't know whether you will fall asleep, but I certainly will. First of all, I want to thank Bobby and the Anti-Trafficking Review for putting this special issue together, and particularly to Sallie, who I first met when I had a chapter in a book of hers. I think it was about 20 years ago, when she was underage and was trafficked to work on trafficking, and Denise, who is her colleague, who I've known for about the same length of time. Now, I'm a research anthropologist, and as an anthropologist, I couldn't agree more with Sallie's discussion about methodology, because usually you get people say, oh, you're an anthropologist. I took a course on that in college and I really liked it. And then, of course, I went on to do something serious. Or you get, what is it that anthropologists do actually? Well, what we do, in addition to having 2-year summer vacations, is we spend a lot of time, as I put it, sitting, drinking, occasionally spitting, and asking people questions and listening to how they talk about what they do. Now, my main research experience was with Akha people in northern Thailand and in Burma and in Laos. So what was I ended up doing with fishermen in Cambodia? I did do a lot of work in Cambodia, but I was part of a big project that was financed by the Luce Foundation, which had a terrible name called the Mekong Culture Well, all capitalized. And nobody who's part of the project knows who came up with that name. It sounded like some wellness thing where you went and got high colonics from the Mekong. But in fact, it was to bring together a whole bunch of different specialties, from fish people to remote sensing people, GIS people, anthropologists, hydrologists, and it was Ophidian and Michigan State University and Mephalung University and Chiang Mai University and Royal University of Phnom Penh and UNESCO, looking at the impact of the Mekong dams on communities in the lower Mekong. So what I was specifically looking at and interested in was what was happening in the Tonle Sap. And for those of you who, I'm just showing some pictures, so for those of you who haven't seen it, I don't do PowerPoints because I believe unless you're doing statistics or maps, PowerPoints are the death of thought. But I just thought you might get some idea of the communities there. But one of the things is, since basically even pre-Angkorian times, Cambodia, the Khmer Empire, its predecessors and followers were hydraulic civilizations. In other words, they managed water not in the sort of narrow sense that Wittfogel talked about it for rice agriculture, but in terms of canals and transportation, and also fish protein, but also the symbolic control of water. Now, the Tonle Sap is estimated to produce about 1/4 of the world's freshwater protein. That's a lot of protein. And Cambodia consumes more fish per capita than any place else in the world. For the whole population of Cambodia, the last time it was in 2021, the estimate was 52 kilograms per year per person. But for people living around the lake, it's 76 kilograms per year. Now, what is happening now? I think that what Sallie was talking about, which was terribly important, was looking at slow climate change. And as she talked about, it's much more exciting to talk about what's going to happen when sea level rises 1 inch and the Maldives disappear. Okay. And you have this great outflow. But slow climate change is less sexy. And I will just digress with one story. For 15 years, I directed the UNESCO, all UNESCO projects on human trafficking for the region, which is when a number of us in this room met. And at the time of the tsunami, I and my wife were back in the United States for Christmas and New Year's. And I got a call from CBS News, ABC News, Oprah Winfrey's producer, and CNN. And they said, what's happening with all the trafficked children in Thailand? And I said, well, let us reason together. I am 12,500 miles away. But in fact, there isn't any. But then there was, what about Indonesia? And UNICEF, ever willing not to let a good crisis go to waste, there was a UNICEF lady who said, I know it's happening. Well, how do you know it's happening? We were also then at a meeting, interagency meeting together, and she admitted she didn't know what was happening, but wait for it, she raised awareness, which I sort of said, it's like screaming fire in crowded theaters as a method of fire prevention. But in fact, we did a study and we took every single case that anyone had reported in the entire region of people being trafficked. Some you couldn't tell, but there were only 3 confirmed cases. And that was in Sri Lanka, and they were kids who were trafficked for child soldiers. Didn't have anything to do with the tsunami. And the same thing with the Nargis in Burma. And I used to keep saying, if you can find traffickers, hire them to deliver antibiotics, because nobody else can get boats into these areas. So it didn't happen, but everyone was always sure it was happening. It was like all of the people who were sure that every sporting event from the World Cup to the Super Bowl, people were being trafficked. They never were quite able to find them, but that always happened. And so a lot of this is, it's a good way to raise money for organizations. Slow climate change is much more complex. So what's happening in the Tonle Sap is fish yields are going down. Well, as fish yields go down, these fishermen, we can sort of keep this running through, we might see some. The fishermen used to use nets with a certain diameter hole. So they would allow small fish to get through and catch big fish. Now they're using nets that are much smaller. Well, they're not stupid. These are very good fishermen with tremendous knowledge about fish and about what fish to look for where, but there's food insecurity. So you've got lower yields and you have people catching smaller and smaller fish. Well, why is this happening? The reason why it's happening is, as many people in this room know, the Tonle Sap expands flows out during the dry season. So you have this flood pulse. And in fact, you can find inscriptions at Angkor where it talked about harvesting fish, which was always kind of odd. Well, how do people harvest fish? But what happened was when the Tonle Sap contracted, fish would be caught in these pools, and you could see it's on, for instance, on the bas-reliefs on the Bayon Temple, women going out with baskets and literally harvesting fish. So this has been, since ancient times, a vital basis of support of whole state systems. In addition to that, what you have, can we spin through this? Excuse me. Can we? Yeah, this is one thing I want to show. Oh, okay, one more. Oh, that's ice. There we go. Okay, that one, these are small fish. And what they do is they make what's called prahok. So they mash this up. And what Cambodia has had forever in ancient times was access to fish and access to salt. So they would salt these, mash them up, allow them to ferment. And the best prahok, I am told, is 4 years old. Well, what you had when you did that was not only fish protein that could be shipped over distances, but you also had within that calcium and a lot of other basic minerals that you got because you consumed basically the whole fish. Well, now what you've got is there are more of these size fish and very much fewer of the big ones. And the reason for this is because you are getting too much water in the dry season and not enough water in the wet season. Well, why is that? What you have is what's called the sunken forests. Now, those have to dry out for a period of time. And when the water is low, it means that small fish, when the fish spawn, can swim into those forests. There are lots of nice bugs for them to eat, and it's too shallow for big fish to go in and eat them. And that system is breaking down. So what you have is you have too much pressure on the fish that were there. There are fewer species of fish being caught, and the system is slowly breaking down. But one of the points I would make is that what people experience is not climate change, they experience ecological change. Because we had in our project a very key question. How much of this was due to climate change and how much was due to the dams? And there was a brilliant paper by our water modeling people. And if anyone is interested in the paper, I can give you the citation. And what they did was disambiguate this. And what they found was that most of the impact was because of the dams. It wasn't that climate change was not long-term very important, but in fact, what people were experiencing was not climate change, it was ecological impact. So what did this have to do with migration? Okay, these fishermen only ever migrated internally, and it was always seasonal. So people would go to towns and maybe work in a small factory or in a market and so forth. And then when it was time to fish, they would move back. But what's happening now is the government tried to resettle people off the lake to cut down the strain on the lake. Not necessarily a bad idea, but they gave people land, and they sometimes gave them money to make their house, these floating houses, permanent. sometimes the money was actually paid. They gave them the land, but they didn't give them title to the land. The other thing is these people are very good fishermen. They're not very good rice farmers. Just like if you took the very good rice farmers in Cambodia and you stuck them out in the middle of the lake, they probably would starve, okay? And in fact, there's a tradition in Cambodia of what they call the Nyak Loi, which is the land people, and the Nyak Ton, meaning the lake people. And traditionally, they would get together and the fish people would exchange fish for rice and other things that are grown on the land. And then the next thing that happened to the people, this is in Kampong Chhnang, is for some reason, some banks these were banks, not microcredit. And we went to a lot of effort to make sure that this was true, lent people money on land they didn't have title to, which is truly strange. And then what happened is another part of the government came along and made a reserve. Well, I walked through that reserve and there wasn't anything to reserve. It wasn't like it was nesting for cormorants or other sorts of things, but it was going to make good land eventually for someone to grab for a resort. So you had the people who now were located, it took them 5 hours to get to their boats to go out if they wanted to go fishing again, in debt for land they couldn't use. So that meant they had to change their ideas about migration strategies. So what did that mean? There are people, I will wrap up and very quickly, just like the First Lady did, okay? Perhaps even more rapidly. Anyhow, I will speak more rapidly. What happened then is that these people who, in fact, unlike, for instance, people in Battambang who often have connections across the border, many people speak Thai, they have experienced migration. These people had no experience migrating to Thailand. What's more, the poorest and most desperate people cannot afford to migrate legitimately. They have to migrate informally. And one of the things that's interesting in passing is all of you know about the exploitation on Thai fishing boats, which despite what the ILO tells you about their great successes is still happening today. And if anyone wants to discuss it, I'll be happy to. But none of these people who were fishers ever ended up on the fishing boats. There were always non-fishing people who ended up on those fishing boats. But these people then become particularly vulnerable because they don't have connections. They don't have social resources for safe migration, which creates increased vulnerability for those populations. And that was about as fast as I could possibly finish this up. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David, and Sallie and Ruta. So yeah, we have maybe 20 up to 30 minutes left for the event for any comments from the audience or questions for the speakers. And I will remind you, we have one speaker on Zoom, so you can also ask questions to her.
Thank you, all three of you, for a very interesting presentation. I'm an outsider to the topic, but as you were speaking, I was thinking that one thing that really wasn't directly mentioned was the political aspects of this. So my question for Sallie is, in your methodology, how do you distinguish between slow climate change as an impulse and political problems in a country. I'm thinking particularly here of the sub-Saharan and Saharan countries, where the political impetus to migrate and the climate change impetus to migrate must be very difficult to separate from each other.
Yeah, thanks for the presentations and thanks for the call out, David. In fact, I don't think the ILO thinks that there's no exploitation going on tie fishing vessels, but that aside, my question was actually for Sallie. We also have looked quite a bit into this issue of how climate change affects exploitative conditions for migrants in the fishing industry. Interestingly, UNDP and Stockholm Environment Institute did some research on Thailand specifically, looking to sort of project potential scenarios for what could happen with different impacts of climate change, different impacts of IUU fishing in terms of the sustainability of the industry. And of course, that has implications for exploitation of fishers as well. Interestingly, when that research was presented to employers, which you would think, of course, that they would have an interest in the long-term sustainability of their fisheries, the reaction was quite denialist in terms of saying, well, all of these scenarios are too negative. In fact, there's no problems. We can go on fishing as we are. You're being reactionary. I was just wondering, in terms of your study, if you interviewed employers, if what their response to sort of these, visions of, how climate change is going to impact on their profitability, or if, there was a reaction from them to your research. Yeah, thanks.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Well, yes, that's a really good question. And so the paper I published earlier this year on the Bangladeshi and the Tamil migrant workers, the way I framed that paper was I wanted to focus on slow onset climate change events, but I also wanted to focus on gender. I wanted to focus on circular migration, and I wanted to focus on what I call compounding or intersecting factors. So what you're really talking about is an intersecting factor or a compounding factor. So for those particularly the Bangladeshi migrant workers, the decision to migrate because of declining rural livelihoods was not one that was ever or hardly ever taken only because of climate change. It was taken as a result of the intersection of at least 3 or 4 other different factors. And so one of those factors, if I can remember now, was the rising cost of farm inputs, for example. And this is also a really big issue in Tamil Nadu, is that the lack of government support, for example, for farmers. And so, you have these other things going on. In Bangladesh, one of the biggest other factors that was impacting men's decisions was having to pay dowries for their sisters. And the families just couldn't afford to pay the dowries. So, it was never just about climate change. It was always this oscillating and intersecting factors. The other thing about the slowness is not just talking about slow onset events, but also talking about the temporal dimensions of decision making, because these decisions to migrate and these discussion of all these factors was also generally taken over time. And what came through really clearly in the men's narratives about this was, well, I thought about this, or the family discussed this a couple of years ago. We could see it was getting bad, but, you know, it was kind of like a last resort. We put it off and we tried to do this or this or this instead. And then to the point where none of those other things worked. And so that was when the decision to migrate was changed. So that's also a slow factor, right? Is just the decision-making process. So I hope that's kind of answered your question. And yes, Ben, thank you. I know the wonderful work that ILO does on this issue and the ship to shore. Particularly, no, I haven't talked to vessel owners or fleet companies. Probably, I mean, if the ILO would like to fund me, I would be more than happy to do that. I've run out of budget. But, you know, it's a tricky one because in the Philippines, where I do most of this research, it's actually a bit unsafe. It's unsafe to talk to the agencies. And it's pretty unsafe to talk to most of the vessel owners as well. So I would really like to see some ethical and research protocols about how we go about talking safely and ethically to companies that have no interest or very little interest in the health and the protection of their workers or in the environment. How do we actually get to talk to those people? And what does it mean if they end up saying, well, no, I mean, you look at the Chinese fishing fleet, the industrial fishing fleet, you know, they're just interested in putting as many vessels in the water and getting them to as many places as they can in the shortest amount of time that they can. So what do we expect to hear from them? And how, so that's my question to the ILO is what do we expect to hear from them? And also, if we hear the things that we think we probably already know, what do we do then? Like, how do you advocate? How do you awareness raise, right? I mean, we awareness raise with migrant workers so much, but how do we awareness raise within the sector more broadly? So I'm sorry, I'm throwing the question back to you. I'll stop.
I would like to raise a question to Mr. Anthropologist. It's about like how we can preserve traditional value, culture, value, lifestyle, and you know, in the age of like rapid changing and transformation. Because like I feel as a youth, it's also not about like blue laborers and things like white worker, fresh graduates and things also, and encountering like, you know, like workforce employment in this, like, and also uncertainty, insecurity as the global trend is like political tensions, war instead of like environmental restoration, social restorations, but how we can adapt, like, you know, create values and like resilience and reinventing to like, you know, there's like have to hear the words as it's like too sick sometime, right? So like how we can as a youth, as a or somebody who interests in this like you know, chaotic, sometimes it's even challenging. It's like for professions or some engineer, whatever, like rapid pace of like technological development, like AI or something else, like the value of humans getting lost, right? Like robotizations, or though we don't know, but like, you know, the values of workforce, time, craft, and we're becoming like victims of like consumerism and capitalism. But how we can, you know, change and fight against back.
Well, if I actually knew the answer to that, I would be out solving the world's problems right now. No, but seriously, I think that people often underestimate the value of traditional beliefs and values. And let me give you a concrete example as opposed to sort of abstract UNESCO talk. When there was a dam of some years ago that fell down in Attapur in Laos. And my late wife was part of the UN post-disaster assessment team. And after they got the World Bank and everything else, they said, oh, culture, I guess we should get somebody from UNESCO. So they got Heather. And when she actually talked to the local people there who had had everything wiped out, and they needed very concrete things. They needed a place to live. What did they really want? What was people said? What they wanted was their local temple rebuilt. Now, they didn't mean rebuilt in some, like Wat Praker or something. They wanted a place where the community could come together. Now, one of the sad things is this community, all these years later, is still living under blue plastic. But they did get their temple, which they did basically on their own. So a lot of times in these crises, people see this as, epiphenomenal, as sort of pakchi, something that's nice and added. But for the local people, it's really important. And one of the resources that communities have is community solidarity. And that just doesn't come like this. It comes through institutions that people participate in. And those institutions change. It doesn't mean, doing everything the same way your great-grandfather did. But most people value those things. And when you have things like UNESCO talks about intangible cultural heritage, it's not just, giving a name to Kampot pepper because it's the best pepper, which it is, but it's things that are important to local people that they decide is important to them, not an anthropologist or a UN official or somebody from the outside. And if you look to get back to fishing, 40 years ago, there was no trafficking onto Thai fishing boats. Why? Because Thai fishing boats were smaller. They were crewed with exchange labor. So Ben's family would come and work on my boat, and my family would come and work on his boat, and we didn't have to go out too far. But with the destruction of coastal fishing that is happening all over the world, you need bigger boats, have to go out farther, greater expense, bigger crews. There are also other economic opportunity. So that contributes, it doesn't cause it, but contributes to forced labor, which is widespread on fishing boats. And I wish I had a better answer for your really excellent question, but that's the best that I can do.
Real quick before you, that made me think about something. It's, about what people value actually is really important, because a lot of international organizations and the humanitarian aid that goes in post-disaster, they think they know, right? What needs to be done, what needs to be reconstructed or rebuilt. And a classic example of that quite recently, there's been so many typhoons in central Philippines and in the Bicol region as well. We heard about that before. But, one of the post-disaster reconstruction projects is to give some internally displaced people new land, right? And these kind of new dwellings that are climate resilient or disaster resilient, if you want to say. But what's happening is people don't want to move to these new places. So they're selling the land and the new houses to other Filipinos, generally middle-class Filipinos, who are very concerned about the impacts of climate change and disasters. And so we have this really great term that I've just heard about, climate gentrification. And so what are the people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of this new land and housing doing? They're using the money that they get from selling those to middle-class Filipinos who want safer houses, and they're using that money to fund their migration abroad for work. So, you know, we think we know, but how much do we know really if we don't go in and actually ask people? So it's just kind of like a pat on the back to David about that.
Hi, thank you. And I think like it's similar to what you brought up. So I'm a journalist and I've been covering like environmental issue in Thailand for quite some years. And so like for the Mekong issues, like because of the communities have been migrated because of the dams. And right now it's like some people like view that the hydropower is false solutions of the climate issues. So what do you think of these issues, and how do anthropologists like think about like false solutions as part of like climate migration issues? Like how do you like navigate that?
So okay, so I have two related questions. One, I follow social movements, not necessarily specifically in Thailand, though also in Thailand. And I know that the fisher folk federations in Thailand have been fighting the industrial fishing fleet and government policy that gives fishing areas over to industrial fisher, whether they're Thai or not. And there's sea grabbing and coastal grabbing going on that and overfishing as a result of the industrial fisher folk. That all clicked into my mind when David was giving his last answer. And so I'm wondering about what are the social struggles that are going on around this, whether it's trade unions or fisher folk federations or other things like that. And then related to that, usually in my experience with those kind of social movements is they're fighting against capitalism, which I didn't hear mentioned. I also missed the first speaker, but it seems to me that we're seeing a lot of the effects of capitalism, extractivist capitalism, and how it plays out through neocolonialism and internal colonialism inside countries. And so whether it's building dams or destroying the climate or putting forth false solutions to climate change or driving sea grabbing or putting false solutions to climate change like wind turbines in the sea and destroying fishing areas. Like it seems to me that that's the one thing that ties everything that everybody talked about together. But I didn't hear it mentioned except by the question from back there. Thank you.
Let me start with you. I mean, Thailand is fortunate in that it has very dynamic civil society. Sometimes, which is they run into problems, but compared to other countries, I mean, you're much better off being an environmental NGO in Thailand than you are in Cambodia. You know, it generally works better. And you have communities that are trying to exert both political pressure, sometimes effective, sometimes not, but also they're doing a lot of community-based monitoring, which is very effective because if you have researcher can go in for maybe a year, but Chiang Mai University pioneered this years ago with helping a community that was dealing with a dam program of training local villagers to monitor on a daily basis changes that were happening. And this helped them a lot when they went to court, because they went to court to prevent this because they were being damaged. Does this work all the time? No. But there is a great basis in Thailand for dealing with these things. Now, I would disagree with you on one thing. It isn't capitalism, it's states. Because I guess you could call China, do you want to call China capitalist? Okay, well, they don't happen to think so. Can you name a non-capitalist state in the world? Okay, Cuba, and how are they doing? Yeah, but in other words, you got, okay, maybe there's one other, but that isn't going to change. So the fact is how do you ameliorate? Because capitalism is very good for some things and not very good for other things. I meant when Vietnam had one guy sitting in Hanoi that told everybody when they should plant their rice, it went very badly. When they got away from that, they became one of the most productive rice producers in the world. But just because you want to, it's good to produce lots of rice, right? Your population doesn't starve, you can export it. Yeah, well, okay, and the choice is a shortage of rice and not enough food. But in other words, I think it's really nice to say it's capitalism or it's this or it's that. Nobody has a very clear idea of the best way to address all environmental issues. And at least my view is that you have trade-offs. And those trade-offs have to be addressed realistically, not like some politicians in the United States who pretend that, the climate isn't changing. It is changing. And it's not changing for the better for our particular species. It's great for spreading mosquitoes. If you're a mosquito, you love climate change, okay? If you're the dengue virus or you're the plasmodium parasite, you love climate change. For humans, it doesn't tend to be a good thing. So in other words, I think we can address certain of these problems without necessarily having to first address the entire world system. I don't know. I'm sure that's not a satisfying answer, but it's the best I can do.
Okay. Yeah, would you like? Yeah.
I think ASEAN Act has just done a little bit of work looking at political economy. And I think, that's probably the one term that I would highlight is that, that obviously there are major governance and regulation gaps in this region that are impacting the ability to mitigate climate change and address other kinds of environmental degradation. And, obviously one of those political economy facts is corruption. And so I feel that, I appreciated that ASEAN Act study because it's the first one to really have highlighted this as an issue. But the elephant in the room for me is corruption and the lack of oversight and the lack of on-the-ground regulation. So, that's a collusion between capital and state. And I don't think that you can really look at one or the other and say, yep, this is where we need to be pointing the fingers. So that's my 2 cents worth for that.
Okay. Thank you so much, David and Sallie.
Would it be all right if I added?
Ruta would like to also say something, and then we're going to close.
Just very quickly with the last points about state systems and corruption. One of the interesting points about so the research that we did did look into local and state level actions as well, and the degree to which these actions affected what people did, how they did it, how they experienced climate, etc. And corruption was a really big factor in that. So there were specific examples given of, for instance, there was a road that was half paved, and everybody in the local community was like, okay, well, we're waiting for the next election because in the run up to the next election, they're going to pave the next half of the road. Similarly, there was a lot of understanding that the states kind of from on high would make investments that would further disadvantage people who were already in poor shape. So, for example, there was a neighborhood living by a road. The road was upgraded, but the state didn't necessarily look into how exactly waterfall off the road would affect the local neighborhood. So the local neighborhood beside the road just started getting flooded every time there was a rain, which increased the effects of climate change. Basically, going to the point about capitalism versus the state, I think what we could see in what we did was the actions that seemed most adapted were the most local. But the degree to which local communities actually had both agency and resources politically was reasonably low. I don't know to what degree that actually helps to answer the question, but it was something that we found super interesting coming out of the research. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruta, and thank you, everyone. I will pass now to our host for a few closing words.
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. We are very happy that this issue is addressed in such a very informative way. We have learned like many new highlights and insights on how it impacts both all the vulnerable population, whether it be women, children, or even men in the case that Sallie presented. So thank you again for joining us on our migration focus week here at C Junction. On Saturday, we will also have another event on migration, and that would be Thai migrants in Finland in berry picking in one of the most scandalous case of exploitation. And it's a documentary screening, Bloodberries, at 5 o'clock. So 5 p.m. on Saturday, if you are still interested, if you are around, please join us. Thank you so much, Borislav. And the new issue of the Anti-Trafficking review can be accessed online via QR code near the registration table. We have some snacks and tea. You guys can stick around for some conversation. But thank you again. Don't forget to donate to support our events going forward. Have a good night.